Hello. In the last video, we left off with a discussion of why communist societies fail. And the main focus was on this concept of centralized versus decentralized control systems. In a communist society or any other type of command economy, all decisions are made by a bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy, it has to collect the data, it has to analyze the data, and then it has to convey its conclusions to the general public. It has to circulate around new instructions. And as we saw, the real world is so complex. There are so many different prices and quantities, and they change so much that this is impossible for humans to do. It's impossible for them to do even when aided by mechanical means like computing. Yet markets are able to do this automatically because they play a sort of magic trick. They take what looks like chaos and turn it into this grand coordinated ballet because they take self interested behavior and turn them into signals. When a person bids up the price of a good because they want the good, that acts as a signal to the market that says, hey, producers, you need to increase output and allocate more resources to this sector. When people refuse to buy a good and producers have to bid the price down, that acts as a signal that says, hey, producers, you need to allocate less resources to this sector and produce less of the good. Nobody is intentionally trying to control it. Nobody goes to the store thinking of themselves as an economic planner. Yet, because their decisions have an impact on other people, it acts as a signal. And when you have millions of people all doing this at the same time, it allows for a vast amount of data to not only be collected, but also organized and analyzed rapidly. But the analysis is not done by the government. It's not done by the individual consumers and producers participating. Instead, it's done by a sort of collective brain, as Matt Ridley describes. It's done by the market itself, drawing upon all of these individual decision makers. And this leads us to our founding father of modern economics, Adam Smith, because he was the first man in history to think this way. Now, Smith was a Scottish moral philosophy professor in Edinburgh, and he was writing at the time of the Scottish Enlightenment. Now, what is the Enlightenment? I would hope that most of you have been exposed to this before in history class, but it's a kind of complicated thing to answer. But the Enlightenment was essentially the period in which people began to think in a modern way. It was kind of like a second wave of the Renaissance, but it completed what the Renaissance began. And the main idea was that people were capable of using rationality. They were capable of thinking rationally to solve problems and to understand their environment. And it also prioritized the sanctity of the individual. In contrast to earlier periods that were dominated more by certain collectivist religious influences, in the West, we're mostly talking about medieval Catholicism. In contrast to that, the Enlightenment believed it took a very positive view of humanity. It didn't argue that we were all perfect, although there were some Enlightenment philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who went overboard with it. But it believed that people had the capability to run their own affairs, the capability to make a better society. The Enlightenment was also heavily influenced by religious thought as well, but it was a different type of religiosity. Many Enlightenment philosophers were what's called deists. Deism was a belief that God existed, God created the world, but they rejected having a specific organized religion. They believed that God designed the world to operate on its own through natural principles. And you often hear this expressed through a metaphor of a clockmaker, that God was like a clockmaker who set the world up as a clock to tick along mechanically. And for both the deists and the Christians, they had this approach to science that they called natural theology. See, in those days, there was not an association of atheism with science yet. That's inaccurate even in today's world, but back then especially, whether they were Christian or deist, atheists were still very rare. Scientists tended to view science as being a godly activity because they believed that in studying the natural world, they were uncovering not only the principles by which God had made the world, but they were also discovering his intent for it too. There was a very common belief that the world had a purpose, that everything was meant to fulfill some sort of role, to have some intention behind it, and that included people, and it included how they interact with each other within a society. And this is where Adam Smith's moral philosophy comes in. Moral philosophy, nowadays we would call it ethics. There's a little bit of civics in there too. I think I already said he was not a businessman. He was not setting out to create a science of commerce. But what interested him was this question: how does society even function when you don't have one grand supreme poobah giving the orders? See, for most of history, like I told you, we had these traditional economies. We had pharaohs, we had Incas, we had emperors, and we had popes telling people what to do. But by the time of the Enlightenment, that was no longer really true. Serfdom had been on its way out in Western Europe. Colonization had brought about global trade for the first time. And Smith is writing in the 1760s, the 1770s. He's writing at the same time as the American founding fathers. 1759, he publishes The Theory of Moral Sentiments while the French and Indian War rages. 1776, he publishes his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations. The first book on capitalism comes out the same year as the Declaration of Independence. It was a time when European civilization was becoming much more free, much more decentralized, but nobody understood yet how it worked. And that was what mystified Smith. So whereas a lot of the other Enlightenment writers were working in political philosophy, like say John Locke and Thomas Jefferson were, or they were working in the hard sciences, Smith was interested in applying this sort of natural theology perspective to the mundane of life. How can we interpret order, intentional order, out of what otherwise looks like chaos? Now, what Smith did, and this made him different from other kind of proto-economists of the time. Most men that wrote on economic issues focused on society as a whole. They would start by looking at the entire society, the entire state, and then they would analogize it to an animal. They would argue that society is like an organism, and that organism, you could then use anatomical metaphors to describe how it functions. What Smith did, though, was he inverted it, because he actually starts from the individual and then builds up. And in particular, he recognized the role of price signals and of selfishness or self-interestedness in planning. And he came to this very counterintuitive result. What he realized was you can have a situation where everyone is just following their own self-interest. Everyone's watching out for themselves, not necessarily thinking about the impact they have on others. Yet, as long as the incentive structure is good, you can then get a good outcome for society. If doing the right thing for society is rewarded by a society, then you can have a world full of selfish people, and yet the system doesn't break down. He often focused on examples of interpersonal trade. That a butcher, for example, doesn't do their job out of the kindness of their heart. Instead, they butcher the meat because they plan to sell the meat and then buy other products that they need. And likewise, the butcher's customers don't pay the butcher just to keep the butcher going, but they do it because they want his products. Yet, this voluntary trade ends up resulting in good outcomes for both the customer and the producer. And everyone that is a producer is also a customer by extension, because people produce so that they can earn the money to consume. And Smith had this metaphor, kind of quasi-religious, because he's writing in a very religious time. He sort of draws from natural theology when he says it's as though society is being steered by these invisible hands. Invisible hands that direct people to socially useful outcomes. Purchase this product that somebody needs to sell. Produce this good that somebody needs to buy. It's invisible because we don't consciously think about it. But each person is responding to their own needs, and by fulfilling their needs, it fulfills other people's needs, and so everyone's behavior is coordinated. Before Adam Smith, most philosophers took a very negative view of human nature. They tended to lean towards very authoritarian systems of government. They tended to favor very totalitarian systems of social organization. They weren't necessarily in control, and so they didn't always get to implement their vision of society. But Smith was one of the first people to look at freedom as a good thing. At the same time, when men like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and Madison were advocating for individual freedom in a political sense, with democracy, with the right of people to choose their own government, Smith was serving as the first and most eloquent advocate of freedom in a person's right to control their own individual life, to buy and sell, and to choose the job that they wanted, and to choose to live where they wanted. Because he had confidence that even if there were some flaws within the system, for the most part, this freedom would result in good outcomes for society as a whole. Because he recognized that selfishness is not always bad. It's bad when it goes astray. It's bad when it is not controlled by society towards a productive end. And this was a powerful idea because it proposed that we could have a different world. There were alternatives. We did not have to live in the tightly regimented world of kings and bureaucracies. You might contrast it to the terror-driven central planning of communist societies and of traditional kings and warlords alike. And you can also contrast it to the failure of utopian communes. There was a business in San Francisco in the 1960s, Summer of Love. Some hippies opened up a store called the Free Store. And the premise of the Free Store was that everything was free. And you might ask, well, how are you going to, like, how is the store going to operate if it doesn't have a profit? And the answer was, well, people will be free to donate. They can bring stuff and they can take stuff, and we're just not going to have any limits on it. How long do you think the Free Store worked? It shut down pretty quickly. It turned out that when you don't have any limits, most people just take as much as they can, as fast as they can. Almost nobody donated, but everybody wanted a slice of it. Throughout the ages, people have always wanted to create a new order. Communism failed. I'm reminded of a quote from Franklin Roosevelt. Those who seek to establish systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers call this a new order. It is not new, and it is not order. What made Smith different was not that he advocated for human freedom, because the communes always did. They were always hippies. The specific kind of hippie changed over the ages. In the past, these hippies tended to be prophets, but there were always hippie types running around who wanted to dynamite the order completely, because they believed that if only you could sweep the order aside, you would be able to make a utopia. They believed that human nature was inherently good, and you could fix everything in the world just by taking away the controls. And then there were always those who viewed human nature the opposite way, that it was inherently depraved and it had to be controlled, whether by a party apparatchik or a churchman. But what neither of them understood was that human potential could be good or bad. Choice could be good or bad, depending on how choice was managed. And that was what Smith brought to the world. After Smith, there was an explosion in economic writing. And most of it focused, like him, on individual rational decision making. And most of it also built off of his supply and demand model. Even Marxism was built off of his supply and demand model, but it varied in some very important respects that resulted in it becoming a completely different strand of economic thought. But there were flaws. Smith himself did not believe that markets are always better. He didn't believe that pure unregulated capitalism was good. See, the machine of the free market, it doesn't always work. Machines can break and machines can be on the wrong settings. I told you, right, that the free market is like an organic computer built out of us. Or maybe not even organic, but it's more of a computer of our thoughts and of our actions and our communications to each other. A ghost. Invisible hands of that ghost. Well, computers can glitch. Computers can get bad outcomes if the code is bad. Machines break down. And in particular, there are two main ways that the market can break down. One is that you can be forced away from the competitive equilibrium. And another is that your social benefits and costs can fail to line up with the private benefits and costs. If the market isn't set up to reward good behavior, then you're going to get bad results. And for each of these two problems, it can run in two ways. I've labeled this too high and too low. That deserves a little more elaboration. But essentially, it can vary in two different directions. And it can also be caused by the government, or it can be caused by a lack of government. And we call all of these situations failure because the market fails to achieve the most efficient outcome. And additionally, property rights can make an important difference. There are market failures that come from a resource not being private, what we call the tragedy of the commons. And there are market failures that come from a resource not being publicly provided, what we call free rider problems. And together, these add up to 10 policy and market failures that we will explore. In this topic, see, I wanted to introduce your most simple pair first so that you would already see what a failure is like. You could already understand the concept of failure before talking about the others. So price ceiling and price floor, you've met already. But we also have taxes and subsidies. We'll see how taxes and subsidies distort people's incentives to wind up producing too little or too much. And there are situations where a market isn't competitive. You only have one buyer or you only have one seller, and that causes problems. And there are situations where society does not punish or reward people for the consequences of their actions properly, resulting in too little, or too much. Various ways that the government can step in or fail to step in and thus cause problems. But in the coming weeks, we will be studying all of these. Ask ourselves, why do these happen? How can they be fixed? And even when can these be worth having? Because some failures actually come with their own benefits. And sometimes tolerating the failure is worth it. This was the core motivation of Adam Smith and the other worldly philosophers that you'll be meeting in your Heilbronner book. They wanted to make the world a better place through better planning. They weren't inventors. They didn't introduce new technologies, new means of producing. They weren't all political philosophers interested in creating new forms of government. They weren't theologians who were focused on spiritual matters. They weren't artists who wanted to create things of beauty. But they all had a desire to shape the world because they believed that their belief systems would allow for more prosperity. They believed that the world was poorly run, whether that meant a market out of control or a government out of control. And if we could just step in and implement the solutions that they provided, that would fix it. Some of them were right, some of them were wrong, some of them left a mixed legacy. But that's what this class is going to be about. In the next one, we'll pick up with taxes and subsidies. See you then.